The moment you see no one cares, your life transforms. Sartre's truth. Let's begin with a moment, not a loud, cinematic moment, but a quiet, almost invisible shift that can change everything. Imagine you're walking through your life, weighed down by the constant pressure to be liked, to be understood, to be understood, to be approved of. Every word you say, every post you make, every outfit you wear is filtered through the gaze of others. You rehearse your life like a performance, hoping the invisible audience claps. But then, one day, something strange happens. Maybe it's after a heartbreak. Maybe it's after years of trying your best and still being ignored. Maybe it's just a sudden random clarity. You realize no one actually cares, not in the way you thought they did. And that realization, though it feels like a death at first, is the beginning of freedom. This is the moment Jean-Paul Sartre was speaking to when he said, "Man is condemned to be free." At first glance, it sounds harsh. Condemned? Isn't freedom a good thing? But Sartre wasn't being cynical, he was being precise. What he meant is this: there is no script, no grand purpose handed to you, no universal audience grading your choices. You are radically free, and that freedom comes with the terrifying responsibility of creating meaning in a world that doesn't hand it to you.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
And when you realize no one cares, not really, not constantly, not deeply about your every move, that's when you finally understand what Sartre was trying to say. The prison you thought you were in of judgment, of expectation, of social pressure was never locked. You were holding the door shut from the inside. You were performing for a crowd that was never watching. And now that you've seen it, you can't unsee it. You finally see the absurdity of it all. But here's the twist. This isn't the moment where you become nihilistic. It's the moment where you wake up. Because if no one is watching, if no one truly cares, then you are free to build your life on your own terms. You don't need to impress people who aren't even paying attention. You don't need to be liked by people who barely understand themselves. You don't need to be validated by a system that doesn't know what to do with your individuality. You get to choose, and that's terrifying. But it's also sacred. Sartre's existentialism isn't about despair, it's about ownership. When you realize that no one is coming to save you, that no one is assigning value to your actions, you stop waiting. You stop blaming. You stop outsourcing your life to imagined spectators. And then something else happens. You begin to act. Not because you want attention, not because you want applause, but because action itself becomes the only honest response to existence. You begin to build, to create, to explore, not for them, but for you. Think about this. How much of your life is shaped by the fear of being misunderstood? How many times have you hesitated, not because the thing wasn't right, but because you were afraid someone might not approve? Sartre would say that's bad faith, mauvaise foi. It's when we lie to ourselves to avoid the responsibility of freedom. We pretend we're trapped by others' expectations, but really, we're just afraid of what it would mean to live without excuses. And here's where it gets even more mind-bending. When you finally stop caring about whether people care, when you step fully into the absurd freedom of your own existence, people start to care. Not because you're trying to impress them, but because authenticity is magnetic. When someone lives without apology, without performance, without the need to be seen, it's impossible not to look. You become a mirror, a threat, an invitation. You remind others of the freedom they buried under layers of pretending. and some will hate you for that, but others will be awakened by it. This is the paradox Sartre unearths. The moment you accept your aloneness is the moment you become most connected, not through dependency, but through truth. Because only a free individual can truly meet another individual. Anything else is just two masks talking. But let's not romanticize this too quickly. This moment, this realization that no one cares, is also excruciating. It can feel like the collapse of meaning, like the world just went silent. You may feel invisible, abandoned, exposed, and that's real. That's not weakness, that's the death of illusion. Every transformation begins with a collapse, and this is yours. But don't rush through it. Sit in it. Let it burn away everything false. Because on the other side of that fire is a life no one can take from you. So let me ask you something that might haunt you. If no one cared what you did, if no one was watching, what would you still choose to do? Who would you still be? That's not a hypothetical. That's the realest question you can ever ask. And your answer is the beginning of your actual life. The freedom crisis, why most people fear their own power, and how Sartre dared us to use it after the shock of realizing no one cares. But after the curtain falls and the imaginary audience dissolves, you're left standing alone on the stage of your life. There's no script, no director, no applause, just you, the silence, and the infinite possibilities of what to do next. And this is where most people panic. Because while we say we want freedom deep down, most of us are terrified of it. Sartre called this the anguish of freedom. It's not the fear of punishment or failure, it's the fear of being the author. The fear of being responsible for everything you are and everything you're not. Because the moment you accept that no one else is writing the story, the pressure shifts entirely. You can no longer blame your parents or society or your circumstances. You can't say, "I didn't have a choice." Sartre strips that away. He says, you always have a choice. Even in the worst of situations, your internal response, your stance toward reality is yours. That's freedom, and that's the crisis. Why is this so terrifying? Because it removes our favorite shield, victimhood. We want to be free, but we also want to be safe. We want to be powerful, but we also want to be blameless. We don't want to be judged for our outcomes. So we invent stories about how we were held back, misunderstood, unlucky. We cling to these stories not because they're true, but because they protect us from the unbearable truth. We are not limited by the world nearly as much as we are limited by our own refusal to act. And here's what Sartre knew, that most people will do anything to avoid this truth. They'll build entire identities around being trapped. They'll stay in jobs they hate, relationships that drain them, lives that suffocate them, because the alternative is too raw. If I accept that I'm free, then I have to accept that my life is mine to shape. That every day I delay, every compromise I make, every excuse I tell myself, it's all on me. That's not just a burden, that's an existential earthquake. But here's the twist. Inside that earthquake is power. Real power. Not the kind that comes from controlling others, but the kind that comes from finally controlling yourself. Sartre didn't want to depress us, he wanted to dare us. He believed that once you confront your freedom fully, you can begin to live intentionally, not reactively, not passively, but as a conscious creator of your reality, that you become the sculptor, not the sculpture. So what does that look like in practice? It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's as simple as saying no to something that used to own you. Sometimes it's waking up and choosing to rewrite your story instead of reliving the old one. It's not about rebelling for the sake of rebellion. It's about choosing with clarity. Sartre called it authenticity, living in alignment with who you are without hiding behind roles or expectations. But authenticity isn't a brand. It's not a style. It's a battle. Because the world will constantly try to pull you back into bad faith, into performance, into safety. And every day you'll have to choose again, do I live from freedom or do I run from it? Let me ask you something uncomfortable. What excuse are you still using to avoid your own power? What lie have you made so comfortable that you've forgotten it's a cage? Sartre would say that the moment you drop the lie, even if it shakes your entire identity, you begin to exist. Truly, not as someone waiting for permission, but as someone who finally understands you are the source. This is the crisis and the gift of freedom. It will not hold your hand. It will not tell you what to do. But it will give you something no system, no person, no philosophy can give you, yourself. And once you meet yourself, without the masks, without the roles, without the stories, you'll never go back. Because when you stop fearing your freedom, you stop fearing life. Beyond the gaze, why living without an audience unlocks your deepest self, there's a moment, quiet but irreversible, when you stop living for the camera that isn't there. When you no longer adjust your life to be seen. When you realize that the you've been curating on social media, in conversations, even in your own mind, isn't who you are, but who you thought others wanted you to be. Sartre called this the gaze, the imagined eyes of others that shape and distort our behavior. And when you finally step beyond it, when you stop living for the gaze and start living from within, something extraordinary happens. You meet your deepest self. But first comes the discomfort, because when we remove the gaze, we also remove the mirror. And without that reflection, we feel lost. Who are we when no one is watching? Who are we when there is no feedback, no likes, no applause, no judgment? The silence can be deafening, but it's in that silence that we begin to hear something else, our own voice. Not the voice trained to please, to explain, to justify, but the voice that simply is. And for many of us, that voice has been buried for years. We've been taught to perform. From childhood, we learn what gets approval and what doesn't. We learn to smile when we're confused, to stay quiet when we disagree, to fit in even when we're breaking inside. We learn to fear being misunderstood more than we fear being fake. And slowly, without realizing it, we become strangers to ourselves. We don't make choices, we imitate them. We don't live, we act. But the gaze is a lie. It promises safety, but delivers suffocation. And the more we feed it, the smaller we become. Stepping beyond the gaze isn't about becoming a rebel or retreating from society. It's about reclaiming intimacy with yourself. It's about doing things because they are meaningful to you, not because they look impressive or edgy or aesthetic. It's about creating art that moves you, building a life that nourishes you, saying words that feel true, even if no one sees, no one likes, no one claps. Because when you stop living to be seen, you finally begin to see. And this is where Sartre's philosophy becomes deeply spiritual. He wasn't just talking about abstract freedom, he was pointing to a sacred inner sovereignty, a kind of existential solitude where you don't need the external world to validate your being. You don't need to be reflected to exist, you just are. And that's where real power lives, not in domination or attention, but in presence, in rootedness, in knowing that your life matters because you're living it, not because someone else approves of it. Think about it. How much of your energy goes into managing perception? How many of your dreams have you edited down to be more palatable? How many truths have you swallowed just to stay likable? And what would it feel like just for a moment to stop, to act without needing to be understood, to speak without rehearsing the reaction, to move through the world not as a performer, but as a presence? That's what happens beyond the gaze. You stop asking, "How do I look?" and start asking, "What do I need to learn?" You stop asking, "Will they approve?" and start asking, "Is this true for me?" And that shift is everything. Because once you find that place inside you that no one else can touch, you become unshakable. But not because life stops being hard, but because you stop being divided. You are no longer split between who you are and who you think you should be. You become one. And ironically, this is when you become most impactful. Not when you are trying to be seen, but when you are fully being. People don't follow those who perform authenticity, they follow those who embody it, who live from a place so real, so rooted, so unshakably themselves that it wakes something up in others. Because presence is contagious. And when you live beyond the gaze, you give others permission to do the same. So let me ask you, who would you be if no one ever saw you again? If every move you made was invisible, would you still make it? Would you still write the book? Still climb the mountain? Still speak the truth? That's the test. That's the freedom. That's the path beyond the gaze. Because when you stop living to be seen, you start living to see not the world's reflection, but your own radiance. The final rebellion why living authentically is the most dangerous and liberating act of all by the time you reach this point standing outside the gaze, no longer tethered to the expectations of others, something irreversible has happened. You've crossed an invisible threshold. You've stopped asking the world for permission to be yourself. And now what you face is the final rebellion. Not against institutions, not against society, not even against the people who doubted you, but against the false self you once believed you had to be. This rebellion is quiet. It doesn't scream. It doesn't seek revenge. But it is total, and it is sacred. To live authentically in a world built on performance is a revolutionary act. Because authenticity threatens every system that profits off your insecurity. The moment you stop needing to be liked, you become unpredictable. The moment you stop seeking validation, you stop being controllable. And that's dangerous not just to the status quo, but to every person still clinging to the illusion that safety comes from fitting in. You become a mirror that reflects what they've abandoned. And not everyone will thank you for it. But Sartre would argue it doesn't matter. Because once you see the truth, you cannot unsee it. You can't go back to pretending. You can't return to a life scripted by fear. The taste of freedom, real freedom, spoils everything else. And from that moment on, your only job is to be, not to be perfect, not to be impressive, just to be honest. To live in integrity with your own soul, even if it costs you everything you once thought you needed. And yes, it will cost you. That's what makes it real. You will lose some people. You will be misunderstood. You will be called selfish, intense, too much, or not enough. But what you gain in return is yourself. And that is the one thing no one else can give you. The one thing that makes everything else worth it. This is where Sartre's existentialism becomes not just a philosophy, but a way of life. That he wasn't telling us to reject meaning, he was telling us to create it, to stop living as if life owes us purpose, and instead become the artists of our own existence, to treat every decision, every relationship, every breath as a brushstroke on the canvas of being. And that's what authenticity really is, not the absence of flaw, but the presence of intention. So what does it look like, this final rebellion? It looks like choosing meaning over popularity, depth over comfort, truth over convenience. It looks like waking up and asking, what would I do today if I weren't afraid? And then doing it anyway. It looks like building a life no one claps for but feels right in your bones. It looks like not apologizing for your evolution. And it also means this: you stop needing to be extraordinary. Because the most extraordinary thing you can do in a world of masks is to show your real face. You don't need to be a genius. You don't need 1 million followers. You don't even need to be understood. You just need to be real. And that, paradoxically, is what changes everything. Sartre dared us to be radically free because he knew that authenticity is not a luxury, it's a necessity for a life worth living. And when you embrace that, you become dangerous to the machine. Because you cannot be sold a version of yourself you no longer believe in. You cannot be manipulated by fear when you've made peace with your solitude. You cannot be swayed by applause when you've stopped performing. So let me leave you with this. What would it mean to live a life where every action, every word, every silence came from alignment rather than approval? What if your rebellion wasn't loud or angry but simply real? That's the invitation. That's the calling. That's the moment your life becomes your own. Because in the end, the most radical thing you can do is be yourself fully, fiercely, and without permission. And once you do, you don't need the world to care. You've already transformed.